Assalamu alaikum. When we think about Islam and Muslims, where does that picture in our head actually come from? Well, in this explainer, we're diving into some really fascinating research that argues the image of Islam we see in Western media isn't just a reflection of reality. It's actively built. We're going to break down exactly how that process works, according to the source material.
So think about it for a second. How do we form ideas about entire groups of people, especially people we've never even met? For a lot of us, the answer is the media we consume every single day. It doesn't just tell us stories. It actually frames our entire understanding, creating the pictures in our minds. And that's the core idea our source material really digs into.
Okay, here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start by looking at this whole argument that the image is manufactured. Then we'll get into the key difference between a mental image and a stereotype. After that, we'll explore the specific tools the media uses, see what the resulting image looks like, and finally, connect all of this to the rise of Islamophobia.
So let's jump right into the big idea from our sources. This image of Islam in the West, well, it's not some accident. It's not just a random collection of news stories. The research argues it's an active process of construction, an image carefully shaped over time by some very specific historical and political events.
The research is quick to point out that this isn't exactly new. There's a long history of distortion, but it really zooms in on two key moments. First, right after the Cold War, Islam was increasingly framed as the new ideological threat to the West. And then 9/11. The sources call this a major turning point, basically a golden opportunity to dramatically ramp up the marketing of a negative image.
So how does this whole manufacturing process even work? To really get it, the research says we first need to understand the difference between two key concepts, the mental image and the stereotype.
First up, the mental image. Think of this as the overall picture or impression you have about, well, anything. It's built from all sorts of inputs. And here's the most important part. It's dynamic. It can actually evolve and change as you get new information.
Now compare that to a stereotype. A mental image is kind of like soft clay. You can reshape it. But a stereotype? That's when the clay hardens into a brick. It's rigid. It's resistant to change. It's totally oversimplified, like a ready-made mold that just stamps out the same idea over and over, and it's almost always a negative judgment. It's the final, inflexible product.
So the big question is, how do you turn that soft clay into a hard brick? How does a flexible mental image get hardened into a fixed stereotype? The research points to a very specific toolkit the media uses to shape our perceptions. Let's break it down.
Okay, the research lays out four primary methods. First, you've got selection, deciding which stories get the spotlight, and just as important, which stories get left in the dark. Second is distortion, which is all about framing a story with a particular spin. Third is focusing. This is just the power of repetition, hammering home the same messages again and again until they stick. And finally, personalization, where huge, complex geopolitical issues are boiled down to the actions of a few individuals, completely stripping away the bigger picture.
And it's really important to remember, as our source material shows, these aren't just vague opinions. These are actual academic frameworks, tools used by researchers to systematically analyze media content and its effect on how we all see the world.
And language. Wow, language is a huge part of coloring the narrative. The sources point out that simply using a term like holy war as a translation for jihad is enough to trigger a whole cascade of specific and often frightening associations in the mind of the viewer.
So, after applying all these tools, what's the final image of Islam and Muslims that emerges in the media, according to this research?
Well, the research identifies a pretty consistent and, honestly, a pretty disturbing set of themes. Islam is frequently portrayed as inherently violent and backward. Muslims are often linked directly to extremism and jihad. Islamic culture is depicted as oppressive, especially towards women. And the overarching message? That Islam is fundamentally incompatible with, and even a threat to, Western civilization.
This quote, cited in the source material, is presented as a crystal clear example of this dynamic in action. It suggests collective responsibility, placing the burden for the actions of a violent few onto over 1 billion people. But this idea of collective guilt was publicly challenged. The sources also highlight this really witty response from author J.K. Rowling, which just uses the exact same logic to show how absurd it is.
The research also points to instances of just outright falsehoods being used to build this image. One source details this incredible claim made on American television, that Birmingham, the UK's second largest city, had become a no-go zone for anyone who wasn't Muslim. The reaction was swift and it was widespread ridicule. The British Prime Minister at the time didn't mince his words, calling the expert a complete idiot. The source presents this as a stark example of how a manufactured, frightening image can be completely detached from reality.
And this leads us to the final, crucial step in this analysis. Because according to the sources, this manufactured image doesn't just stay on our screens. It bleeds into the real world, contributing directly to a much wider and more dangerous social phenomenon.
And that phenomenon is Islamophobia. The research defines it as a pervasive fear of Islam and makes a powerful comparison, noting that the term has entered our political language much like the term anti-Semitism did in a previous era, marking a very specific and deeply rooted kind of prejudice. And the sources really stress this isn't just an academic debate. Turning a diverse faith of over 1 billion people into a single, threatening caricature has tangible, real-world consequences.
So here's the final takeaway from the research. By constantly focusing on conflict while almost completely ignoring the daily reality of peaceful coexistence for the vast majority of Muslims, the media isn't just reporting the news. It is actively contributing to a climate of fear and hostility.
Ultimately, this whole analysis leaves us with a really critical question. When we consume media, it's worth asking, who is holding the camera? Who's choosing the angle? And who sets the frame for the picture that ends up in our minds?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. If you found this breakdown valuable and you want to understand more complex topics, make sure you subscribe. We'll see you in the next explainer.